Tonight, we explore the life and legacy of one of the most enigmatic figures in ancient history, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. He was bold, brilliant, and ruthless, a man whose unyielding ambition forged the foundations of a unified empire and whose obsessive quest for immortality led to one of the most haunting ironies in the chronicles of power. His story is carved in stone, buried in a tomb guarded by silent warriors, and echoed in legends that still stir the imagination today. So, before we all settle in, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know where in the world you're listening from. Your support helps keep these timeless stories alive. Now close your eyes, get comfortable, and allow yourself to drift into the distant past, to an age of emperors and alchemists, of ambition and mystery, where one man dared to challenge death itself and built a hidden world beneath the earth to defy it. In the heart of ancient China, during the 3rd century before the Common Era, the winds of ambition stirred restlessly through the palaces of Qin. The empire, newly unified, stretched its power across vast territories, rivers tamed by canals, mountains pierced by roads, and enemies cowed by iron discipline. At its center stood a man who refused the ordinary confines of life. A man crowned emperor not by bloodline alone, but by sheer will and relentless conquest. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, did not rise merely to rule. He rose to conquer time. Years of war had ended with the forging of China's first imperial dynasty. Warring states had been absorbed into one order under heaven. But even as peace settled across the lands, the emperor's gaze turned inward, toward a threat no sword could slay, the creeping certainty of death. To ordinary men, mortality was nature's decree. But to Qin Shi Huang, it was defiance waiting to be subdued. He began with the external world. Walls rose across the northern borders, the earliest bones of what would become the Great Wall. Standardized weights, currencies, scripts, every piece of the fractured past forced into harmony beneath the imperial seal. But still he aged. Still, his body betrayed him. The flesh would not obey as the empire did. He turned to the scholars, the physicians, the mystics. Their words comforted, but their answers failed to hold permanence. So he demanded more. Whispers rose within the court, that immortality was not merely myth, that elixirs existed, buried in sacred mountains or hidden on the islands of the immortals, far beyond the eastern sea. These were no longer the fancies of poets. Not to Qin Shi Huang. They were commands. He issued decrees. Alchemists were summoned from every province. Taoist sages and mountain hermits were lured to the capital with promises of gold and favor. Expeditions were organized, some to search the forests of Penglai, others to sail across the East China Sea, chasing phantoms. One name came to dominate these quests, Su Fu. A court magician, Su Fu promised the emperor what no mortal could rightly offer, a path to eternal life. He spoke of sacred herbs, of divine metals, of potions brewed beneath constellations only he understood. The emperor believed him, or perhaps he needed to believe. Twice, Su Fu was dispatched across the ocean, leading hundreds of servants and artisans on ships heavy with tribute, seeking the fabled lands where death had no dominion. He vanished into the mist. He did not return, but the emperor's hope did not die with the wind. He turned to mercury, quicksilver, liquid metal. Alchemists proclaimed its purity, its indestructibility. It would preserve the flesh. It would purify the soul. It would resist decay. So the emperor drank it. And in doing so, he sealed his fate. His health began to wane. Headaches grew frequent. His moods blackened. The once tireless conqueror became captive to trembling limbs and sleepless nights. Yet he pressed on, expanding the underground project that would become his final sanctuary. A tomb like no other. A kingdom of the dead. The terracotta army, thousands of clay warriors, each face unique, each weapon sharp, rose silently from the earth, ordered to protect their emperor in a realm beyond life. Carved by the hands of artists and slaves, they marched in rows, patient and cold. The emperor would not meet death alone. And so, in the shadows of his growing mausoleum, while ships searched for gods and scholars toiled for potions, Qin Shi Huang, the man who sought forever, walked ever closer to the end he could not escape. He was chasing the sun, but the horizon did not move. As the emperor aged, so did the fabric of his court twist under the weight of his obsession. Ministers, once brave with policy and reform, now spoke in tones shaped by fear. For the one truth known by all, whispered behind silken screens and carried on the wind through palace corridors, was that to question the quest for immortality was to risk disappearance. Records were burned, histories rewritten. The emperor sought not only to escape death, but to erase the memory of mortality itself. He turned against the past. The 100 schools of thought, Confucians, Mahists, legalists, and more, had offered their visions of order, virtue, and wisdom. But Qin Shi Huang had no need for voices that pointed to balance or duty. He ordered their texts destroyed. Scholars who resisted were buried alive or exiled to the frontier. Truth, in his empire, became what the emperor needed it to be. The palace became a mirror of its master. What had once been a seat of rational governance transformed into a theater of divinations and dream readers. Astrologers consulted the heavens daily. If a comet appeared or a crow flew east at the wrong hour, entire villages might pay the price. Superstition became statecraft. Mercury replaced medicine. And through it all, the emperor remained restless. He no longer trusted his surroundings. Assassins had once crept close, a dagger in a zither, a blade wrapped in scrolls. And though those threats had passed, their memory lingered. He surrounded himself with guards, food tasters, secret passages, decoys. His movements were cloaked in layers of deception. No one knew where he truly was at any moment, only where he might be. He rarely slept in the same palace twice. Instead, he traveled ceaselessly, a ghost within his own empire. The imperial carriage became a roving court, its wheels carving ruts through mountains and deserts alike. Along the path, peasants stood at attention, heads bowed, unsure if they saluted the emperor himself or one of his doubles. And always, at every stop, he asked the same question. Have they returned? No. Still no word from Sufu. No word from the east. But behind his back, the whispers returned, this time not of gods or elixirs, but of unease. The court's younger ministers, educated under the old philosophies, began to question. Silently, carefully, they spoke only to each other, behind lantern-lit curtains and beyond the ears of palace spies. They saw the emperor's face grow pale and bloated. They saw his lips tremble after drinking the elixir. They saw the man who had united China crumble into paranoia and alchemical madness. And they feared what would come next. Far from the court, the laborers dug ever deeper. Beneath Mount Li, the emperor's tomb grew vast and intricate. Rivers of mercury were poured into channels to simulate real water. Pressure traps and crossbow arrays were set to fire upon any intruder. The ceiling sparkled with stars made from pearls, the floor mapped with bronze. It was not a tomb. It was a second empire, a world beneath the earth, waiting to receive a ruler who no longer trusted the living world. And still, his body betrayed him. The very substance he consumed to prolong life was poisoning his blood, corroding his nerves. He lost weight. His skin lost its hue. Yet he insisted on more. More tonics, more metals, more rituals. For the emperor believed he was not dying. He was being tested. The gods, surely, required endurance before they offered eternity. So he endured, until, one morning, deep into a royal tour of the eastern provinces, the emperor collapsed. The messengers were sent in secret. The guards closed the carriage door, and the empire held its breath. The moment the emperor's body gave out, somewhere along the eastern provinces in the midst of a restless imperial tour, no horns sounded, no banners were lowered, and no official dared speak the word that lingered thick in the air. For in the moving court, sealed within curtains of silk and guarded by blades sharper than honesty, the sudden stillness of Qin Shi Huang's frame was not acknowledged as death, but rather as an inconvenient interruption to a dream too vast to abandon. In the dim, perfumed interior of the royal carriage, with shadows dancing along its lacquered panels, the emperor's attendants froze not in grief, but in fear, not of mortality, which had at last found the man who believed himself invincible, but of the political storm that would break loose the moment the empire learned the Son of Heaven had become a corpse. Chancellor Li Si, the master architect of the Qin legal system and a man as precise in thought as in ambition, quickly recognized that the death of the emperor could not be treated like the death of a man, for it was the disintegration of a symbol, a rupture in the sky, and if revealed too soon, it would unfasten the empire's fragile cohesion and give rise to succession wars, treasonous murmurs, and opportunistic governors reaching for power across the provinces. With the assistance of Zhao Gao, a calculating eunuch whose mastery of influence extended through every corridor of the palace and who had, over time, become the silent arbiter of courtly power, Li Si undertook a deception so immense and delicate that it required not only silence, but ritual, the construction of an illusion more powerful than truth itself. The imperial carriage continued its journey, guarded as before, with emissaries announcing the emperor's wisdom, his blessings, his orders, all forged by hands now working in service of maintaining order through falsehood. While behind the grand procession, carts of salted fish trailed in silence, their stench intended to disguise the smell of putrefaction that now radiated from the interior sanctum, where Qin Shi Huang, conqueror of kingdoms, lay bloating under silk robes and the fatal dose of his own elixirs. Within that sealed tomb of a coach, the body grew cold as the empire marched on in ignorance, and as the chariot wheels turned, Li Si and Zhao Gao enacted the next phase of their plan, the elimination of those who might threaten their carefully balanced fiction. Prince Fusu, the eldest son of the emperor and the legitimate heir to the dragon throne, had long been a source of unease within the court, for although respected by the army and beloved by the public for his upright character and sympathy toward Confucian ideals, he represented a path of moderation and restraint that could not coexist with the ruthless structure upon which the Qin had been built. And so, with cold ink and false authority, an imperial edict was drafted, bearing the seal of a dead emperor and ordering the prince to commit suicide for supposed disloyalty. A fabricated crime delivered with such force and finality that the prince, trained from birth to obey imperial command without hesitation, complied without protest, even as the loyal General Meng Tian, also named in the forged decree, was condemned to the same quiet erasure. Their deaths, silent and unchallenged, cleared the path for Hu Hai, a younger, weaker son who had neither his brother's virtue nor his father's iron will, and who proved malleable enough to become a vessel for Zhao Gao's ambitions. And thus, upon the false emperor's return to Xianyang, the capital, the grand deception was completed with the final act of statecraft, a delayed funeral, a public proclamation of divine passing, and the ceremonial sealing of a tomb filled with traps, rivers of mercury, and a terracotta army destined to stand watch over a man who had once ruled everything but death. Long before the final collapse of the emperor's body along the eastern road, before salt carts masked the scent of decay and forged edicts reshaped succession, the grandest project of Qin Shi Huang's reign had already taken shape beneath the surface of the earth, far from the noise of court and campaign, in the shadow of Mount Li, a mountain not chosen for beauty or spiritual significance, but for its depths, its promise of secrecy, and its capacity to hold an empire fashioned from stone, bronze, and a man's defiance of oblivion. It was here, decades before death took him, that the first emperor began building what no king had dared imagine, a second kingdom, crafted not for the living, but for the dead. The tomb itself was not a chamber, but a subterranean city, mapped and measured by the most gifted engineers of the age, fueled by the emperor's limitless ambition and built by the calloused hands of hundreds of thousands, criminals, conscripts, artisans, and slaves, all consigned to labor in silence, bound by secrecy, and swallowed by the very earth they shaped. There were no plans to spare them. Their hands constructed the corridors, their eyes memorized the secrets, and their mouths, if they spoke, were silenced forever. At its heart, encased beneath tons of rammed earth and armored against time, was the central chamber, a vast hall said to mirror the celestial order, its ceiling studded with pearls to mimic the constellations, its floor carved with miniature rivers and lakes through which mercury flowed in shimmering imitation of the Yellow River, the Yangtze, and the oceans of the known world. These rivers were more than decoration. They were the emperor's declaration that in death, he would still rule the cosmos, his domain extending beyond the grave into the very structure of the universe. Guarding this necropolis was the terracotta army, not a mere display of imperial vanity, but a calculated defense, an afterlife security force drawn from clay and imagination, forged to match the ranks of a real army in size, discipline, and hierarchy. Thousands of soldiers stood in endless formation, each one unique, each face shaped with careful detail, bearing the expressions of stoic endurance, readiness, and silence. Infantry, archers, generals, cavalry units with horses sculpted mid-stride, all were frozen in the moment before battle, eternal sentinels awaiting the emperor's command. These warriors, buried in pits to the east of the tomb's central chamber, were placed to face the rising sun, a direction both symbolic and strategic, as if to confront whatever threat might approach from the land of the living. Their weapons, once sharp and deadly, were stored with them: bronze swords, crossbows, spears, axes, a full arsenal encased in airless darkness, intended not as tribute, but as a line of defense against time, desecration, or cosmic betrayal. The artisans who shaped these figures labored under watchful eyes, knowing that their work would not merely be judged, but that their lives depended on the perfection of every fold in armor, every sculpted braid, every clenched hand upon a shaft of wood. Mistakes were not corrected. They were buried. Some were buried with their work. Outside this hidden world, the empire lived and breathed, unaware of the scope of what their emperor had planned. To most, the construction site at Mount Li was nothing more than a grand tomb, befitting the founder of a dynasty. Few knew that beneath that mountain, a mirror empire had taken form, one untroubled by rebellion, untouched by time, and undisturbed by the human need for rest. And in this silence, beneath earth and stone, the emperor waited, for eternity, for resurrection, or perhaps for a day that would never come. With the emperor entombed beneath the surface of Mount Li, surrounded by rivers of mercury and a sculpted army incapable of rebellion, the vast machinery of the Qin state continued to move forward. Though without the steady hand of its creator, it no longer moved with certainty or vision, but with the erratic pulse of fear, secrecy, and desperation. The empire that had once marched in perfect rhythm now faltered, led not by the man who had united it, but by shadows wearing the garments of power. Huhai, the youngest son who now bore the mantle of emperor, had not earned his throne through merit, conquest, or the will of the people, but through the quiet manipulations of men who saw him not as a ruler, but as a puppet to be controlled. Zhao Gao, now elevated from a servant of the court to the true master of its fate, guided the new emperor with a hand wrapped in velvet and iron, whispering counsel that served not the state, but his own preservation. The new emperor lacked the fire of his father, the vision, the cruelty, even the paranoia, for Huhai ruled not as an emperor, but as a frightened boy, stumbling beneath the weight of robes too large and expectations too vast, convinced that loyalty could be bought with favors and that silence could be enforced with blood. The purges began early. Ministers who questioned policy vanished. Generals who spoke of reform disappeared. Those who remembered the old emperor's ideals, unity, efficiency, order, were forced to recite new truths or fall with the others into obscurity and death. But what the first emperor had failed to understand, and what his son never grasped, was that an empire cannot be built upon conquest alone. It must be sustained through wisdom, adaptation, and consent, however reluctantly given. The Qin, for all their innovations in law, measurement, writing, and roads, had sown resentment in the provinces they had subdued, and the cruelty used to maintain obedience was remembered far longer than the peace it had purchased. As the corpse of Qin Shi Huang lay hidden beneath layers of earth and traps, as mercury leached into the soil and the terracotta soldiers stood in stillness, the provinces began to stir once more. The same roads that had once delivered armies and grain now carried messages of rebellion. The uniform legal code, once a marvel of efficiency, now chafed like iron chains. The laborers who had been forced to build palaces, tombs, and walls now found common cause in their suffering. The empire had united its people in name, but in spirit, it had only deepened the divides. And in the absence of a living emperor whose will could inspire terror or loyalty, the machinery of Qin control began to collapse under its own weight. Orders were ignored. Taxes were withheld. Armies mutinied. Across the empire, from rivers to mountains, from village to fortress, the people began to speak the unthinkable, that the Qin had lost the mandate of heaven, that their rule was no longer divine, and that the time had come for change. Zhao Gao, seeing power slip through his fingers, clung more tightly to his schemes. He fabricated conspiracies. He turned ministers against one another. He accused generals of treason to justify their execution. But with every act of treachery, the trust that bound court to empire unraveled further. Even the new emperor, once pliant, began to doubt the man who had raised him to power. And when that doubt became fear, Zhao Gao acted first, forcing Hu Hai to take his own life, thus removing the last symbol of imperial continuity. The throne was empty. The dynasty was breaking. And far beneath the ground, in a tomb never meant to be opened, the first emperor lay in silence, unaware that the world he had bent into a single shape was already tearing itself apart. As the throne sat vacant and the court degenerated into suspicion and betrayal, the empire once unified by the iron will of Qin Shi Huang began to unravel with a speed and violence that few had anticipated, though in truth, the signs had been etched into the very foundations of the regime, a state built on fear, commanded through punishment, and maintained by endless labor could only hold as long as the center remained unshakable. And now that center had crumbled into ash, held together only by the illusions of order and the memory of terror. Across the empire's far-flung territories, governors and generals who had once bowed deeply before the might of the Qin began to question whether their loyalty still served them, whether the oaths they had sworn to a dead emperor now bound them to a government dominated by eunuchs and filled with ghosts. Peasant revolts flared first, sparked by hunger, by conscription, by the unending demands for labor and tax. What began as scattered resistance soon congealed into a rising tide, as word spread that the Qin no longer carried the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule, bestowed by cosmic balance and revoked by suffering. Among these revolts rose figures of charisma and vision, men who had once served the Qin or fought against them, now united not by ideology, but by the shared belief that the empire could be broken. Chief among them was Liu Bang, a former peasant turned minor official, a man of pragmatism, patience, and deep political instinct, who rose not through brute strength but through alliances, negotiation, and an uncanny ability to remain standing while others fell. In contrast stood Xiang Yu, a warlord of noble Chu descent, a man of unmatched military prowess and unrelenting ambition, whose army struck with ferocity and whose victories piled higher than any could count, but whose vision for China ended at the tip of his spear. Together, they led the charge against the crumbling dynasty, though not as allies. The rebellion became a war for the soul of the nation. Qin cities fell. Provincial armies deserted. The Great Wall, once a symbol of imperial reach, became a relic of a dying past, unable to protect a center that no longer commanded fear. Within the capital, officials who had once wielded vast power now found themselves besieged, hunted, or ignored. The air grew thick with the stench of betrayal. By 207 BCE, less than 4 years after Qin Shi Huang's death, the dynasty he had forged through blood and law was gone, extinguished not by a single blow, but by 1,000 fractures. The last emperor, a puppet placed on the throne by Zhao Gao, surrendered to rebel forces and was executed without ceremony, a forgotten footnote to a reign that had promised eternity but delivered only chaos. The terracotta army stood untouched. The tomb remained sealed. The empire above had vanished, while below, the emperor still slept beneath poisoned rivers and constellations of pearl. Liu Bang would eventually defeat Xiang Yu and establish the Han dynasty, restoring stability and reshaping the foundations of imperial rule. But even as new banners rose and new laws were written, the specter of Qin lingered, a warning carved into memory that power without compassion breeds rebellion, and that unity imposed by terror cannot endure the weight of human spirit. And as the years turned and the Han expanded their influence, scholars who had once hidden in fear returned to public life, recording not just the victories of the Qin, but their downfall, preserving the lesson that even the strongest empires must serve more than themselves if they wish to survive beyond a single ruler's breath. Centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell, and with each turn of the wheel, the story of the first emperor transformed, from recent memory to sacred legend, from the subject of whispered fear to the object of philosophical debate, until even those who ruled in his shadow spoke of him not as a man, but as a force, a symbol of a time when the impossible had briefly become real. And yet, for all the chronicles written, all the scrolls that described his conquests and his madness, one truth remained hidden beneath layers of earth and myth. The resting place of Qin Shi Huang was untouched, concealed so thoroughly that not even the tomb's exact location could be agreed upon by generations who followed. While the capital moved, while wars redrew maps and emperors carved their names into the stone of mountains and hearts of men, the subterranean empire beneath Mount Li remained sealed, a mausoleum shrouded not only in soil but in mourning. The chronicler Sima Qian, writing more than a century after the first emperor's death, described a world below the ground more vast than any palace above it, a chamber so carefully constructed and lethally guarded that none who entered would ever leave. Poisoned rivers, mechanized traps, crossbows rigged to fire at the slightest intrusion, and beneath it all, the dead ruler, surrounded by wealth, artifacts, maps of his conquests, and the ever-watchful gaze of statues carved in eternal readiness. Even as the Han, Tang, Song, and Ming dynasties reshaped China's politics, culture, and philosophy, the site of the emperor's tomb remained a place of dread and speculation. Farmers avoided plowing too deep near the rumored mountain. Legends grew of divine curses, of ghosts in armor wandering in moonlight, of earthquakes that had nothing to do with fault lines but everything to do with disturbed spirits. For even in death, Qin Shi Huang's presence continued to mold the land around him, casting a long, cold shadow over the centuries. And yet the memory of his obsessive quest for immortality, the alchemists summoned, the mercury consumed, the ships sent into the eastern sea in pursuit of islands that may never have existed, became less cautionary tale and more curiosity, something to be puzzled over by scholars, dismissed by skeptics, and quietly admired by those who saw in him not madness, but a kind of brutal genius. Even as his name became synonymous with tyranny, there was awe beneath the condemnation, for he had done what no one before him had, forged unity from chaos and declared himself not merely king or warlord, but emperor of all under heaven. But the price of that ambition had long since been buried, in laborers' bones, in scorched scrolls, in the vanished voices of scholars silenced beneath his laws. The tomb held not only the body of a man, but the echoes of an age, a silence so absolute that even the loudest rebellions above it seemed to muffle at its borders. No dynasty dared open it. No archaeologist dared probe too far. It was not merely a tomb. It was a message, one written in the language of fear, sealed by power, and preserved by time. And as the soil deepened and dynasties passed like clouds, the world forgot many things, but not the emperor beneath the mountain, nor the army that still waited for orders. In the spring of 1974, in the dry plains near Xi'an, long forgotten by history but still cradled by the ancient folds of Mount Li, a group of farmers digging a well uncovered something unexpected. Not water, not the usual clay or stone, but fragments of pottery, broken yet unmistakably crafted, shards bearing the faint lines of armor, fingers, and human features. At first, it seemed a curiosity, perhaps remnants of a shrine or some provincial grave. But as the excavation widened and archaeologists arrived, the earth revealed its secret with mounting astonishment. What emerged was no ordinary burial site, no regional monument, but a subterranean army of staggering scale and eerie silence. Thousands upon thousands of life-sized soldiers, arrayed in military formation, each sculpted with individual detail, no two alike, frozen mid-stride or standing in readiness, as if waiting for a command that would never come. Their features were distinct: weathered brows, curled lips, knotted hair, pressed armor, clenched hands once holding real weapons that had long since rusted or been looted. And surrounding them were chariots, horses, acrobats, bureaucrats, musicians, an entire society replicated in clay. The terracotta army had returned to human sight. It had not decayed. It had not vanished. It had simply waited. As news of the discovery spread, scholars and governments scrambled to respond, and soon the burial pits near Mount Lee became one of the greatest archaeological sites in the world. Teams began mapping the layout, cataloging the statues, and analyzing the construction techniques. They found traces of paint that had once covered the figures in vibrant color, now faded to the monochrome of time, and they uncovered remnants of bronze weapons still sharp enough to wound, preserved by mysterious coatings and careful placement. But even as the statues were unearthed and studied, the emperor's tomb itself remained sealed. Ground-penetrating radar and remote surveys confirmed what ancient texts had long described: a central chamber buried beneath a massive mound, untouched, its perimeter laced with mercury levels so elevated that scientists hesitated to drill further. The toxic rivers described by Sima Qian were no longer legend. They were fact. Modern China, awed by the precision and scale of what lay underground, declared the tomb off-limits for the foreseeable future. The technology to excavate without irreversible damage did not yet exist. More importantly, the sense of reverence and fear remained. To open that tomb would not simply disturb soil. It would disturb an epoch. It would awaken a man whose ambition had shaken the foundation of the world 2,000 years before. And so, the terracotta army was placed under the watch of museums, researchers, and quiet reverence. Millions came to see them, tourists and historians, poets and politicians, staring into the eyes of clay soldiers who had not blinked in 2 millennia. And behind them, always just out of reach, was the sealed world of the emperor himself, a vast underground cosmos still untouched, still dangerous, still echoing with the last breath of a man who had once commanded that death itself surrender. No order had ever come to that army. No trumpet had sounded. But still they stood, waiting, and above them, in a world that had forgotten the weight of a single ruler's breath, humanity was forced to remember, not just the cost of empire, but the price of chasing forever. As the terracotta army stood revealed to the modern world, its silent presence both awe-inspiring and unsettling, scholars turned again to the core of Qin Shi Huang's obsessions, peeling back the layers of myth to examine the desperate pursuit that had shaped not only his reign but the legacy of his death, the relentless search for immortality and the poison he believed would grant it. The alchemists who served at his court were not mere mystics chanting in incense-drenched halls, but highly trained artisans of secrecy, men who blended early chemistry with cosmological speculation, who believed that by refining metals, purifying essences, and conducting rituals beneath the right stars, the divine balance of the universe might be replicated in a single drink. At the heart of their work was mercury, a substance that seemed to defy natural laws, liquid metal that never solidified in room temperature, reflecting moonlight like a captured spirit, impossible to hold yet impossible to ignore. In Taoist thought, mercury held promise as an agent of transformation, a bridge between realms, and to the emperor, who had spent his life bending nature to his will, it seemed only logical that the key to eternal life would lie in a substance no ordinary man could control. The elixirs they crafted were complex, often involving cinnabar, a mercury sulfide compound, mixed with gold, jade, and exotic herbs. Taken in careful moderation, they promised purification. Taken obsessively, they delivered decay. Over the years, as the emperor consumed these concoctions daily, his courtiers recorded changes not in mood or strength, but in complexion, demeanor, and vitality. His skin grew pale, then gray. His temper, once sharp and cold, became erratic. His thoughts wandered. His memory slipped. Yet none dared intervene. For who could contradict the will of the man who had conquered death in every form but the final one? The irony, so sharp it echoes through centuries, is that the emperor, in seeking immortality, drank himself toward madness and death, his blood turning toxic, his organs slowly eroding from the inside out. The ancient records, long preserved and dismissed, now read like a slow autopsy, chronicling the symptoms of mercury poisoning long before modern medicine had a name for it. The tremors, the paranoia, the hallucinations, the seizures, the fits of rage followed by days of silence. His body, so carefully preserved in legend, had betrayed him entirely by the time he collapsed during his tour of the East. And even in death, the poison lingered, not only within his corpse, sealed in a copper-lined coffin deep within a mercury-drenched tomb, but in the very soil surrounding his burial mound, where levels of contamination remain high to this day, a literal warning embedded in the ground he once commanded. Historians debate whether he truly believed in the elixirs or whether he used them as a final wager, an act of desperation from a man who had seen too many stars fall and too many rivals rise from supposed defeat. Perhaps he believed, as many emperors did, that his will alone could alter nature. Perhaps, after all he had achieved, the unification of the realm, the standardization of writing, law, coinage, and measurement, the suppression of chaos, he simply could not accept that there was one thing he could not conquer. But the universe does not bend for ambition. It bends for no one. And so the emperor, who reshaped the world above, left behind a curse buried deep below, not in wrath or revenge, but in the enduring evidence that death, when chased, runs faster than any man can follow. In the soft light of dawn, as winds sweep over the low hills of Shaanxi and tourists shuffle quietly through the museum halls housing soldiers of clay, the echo of a man's ambition still stirs beneath the soil, whispering across time not in declarations or decrees, but in the silence of terracotta mouths and the untrodden corridors of a tomb that has remained sealed for over 2,000 years. The first emperor of China, whose name once instilled awe and dread in every province, whose laws carved unity from chaos, and whose armies reshaped the geography of power, now lies beneath a mound of earth that has become a mountain of meaning. The tomb, untouched by modern hands, looms as both monument and mystery, a vault of the past locked with a key no one dares turn, a statement of dominion so vast that even today, with satellite eyes and atomic tools, we hesitate to cross the threshold he designed to remain forever closed. Scientists measure the mercury levels. Engineers speculate about the architecture. Historians reconstruct the rituals. But none cross the line, not because they cannot, but because something deeper holds them back. What lies within may be wondrous. Treasures unseen, maps of ancient constellations, records of a lost language of power. But it may also be horrifying. The decayed remnants of a man who, in seeking to escape death, built a sanctuary of poison, guarded by the ghosts of his paranoia, each room a testament to the fear that drove him to silence every rival and silence death itself. Yet Qin Shi Huang endures, not merely in the statues or the tomb or the broken seals, but in the legacy he left behind. His empire, though it fell within years of his death, provided the model upon which later dynasties built their own visions of China. His standardizations of script, coin, axle length, law, outlasted the dynasty that birthed them. Even the name of the nation itself, China, traces a phonetic root to Qin. And so the man who feared he would vanish has, paradoxically, become one of the few whose imprint remains indelible. But memory is not the same as immortality. What lingers now is not the man, but the shape of the void he tried to fill, a caution, not a celebration. His name is etched in granite and history, yet the world he ruled has changed beyond recognition. The roads he built now carry cars. The script he unified glows on glass screens. The people he once ruled, once subjects, now citizens, speak his name in classrooms, not courts. He is no longer a ruler. He is a lesson. And the lesson is this, that to chase forever is to misunderstand time itself. For eternity is not won by force, nor held by monuments, nor swallowed by mercury in golden vials. It is not carved in stone, nor sealed in a copper casket. It is earned in how a life ripples through generations, in the laws that guide, the stories that endure, and the warnings that echo in every ambitious heart that forgets that even emperors must die. Beneath Mount Li, where rivers of mercury still shimmer in the dark, the emperor lies unawakened, untouched, and unchanging. His army waits. His court sleeps. The traps remain set. But time, quiet and patient, erodes all design. One day, perhaps, the tomb will be opened. One day, perhaps, light will fall again upon the face of the man who declared war on death. And on that day, we may see not a god, but a man who ruled everything, except himself. As the echoes of Qin Shi Huang's silent army fade into the shadows of history, their bronze-tipped spears lowered, their mission incomplete, we travel now to a different dynasty, a different kind of empire, and a different kind of ambition. No longer buried beneath earth and mercury, this story rises through palace walls and silken veils into a world of ink, incense, and intrigue. If Qin Shi Huang built an empire to defy death, Empress Wu rose within one to defy every expectation history had for her. She was born in the 7th century, in a China ruled not by one emperor, but by generations of them, men chosen from noble bloodlines, sons of heaven guarded by tradition, ceremony, and law. In this world, women were expected to serve quietly, to exist within courtyards, behind curtains, in poetry and submission. But the girl named Wu Zhao would do none of that. She would walk the path meant only for emperors, and she would do so not as their consort, but as their equal, and then as their replacement. Her story began not with power, but with silence. She was born in 624 CE into a wealthy and educated family of the Tang dynasty, the golden age of Chinese civilization. Wu Zhao learned to read and write at a young age, unusual for girls of her time. She studied history, memorized poetry, and absorbed the intricacies of Buddhist scripture. Her beauty was undeniable, but her mind, sharp, calculating, and relentless, would become her true weapon. At age 14, she entered the imperial court of Emperor Taizong as a concubine, one among many, chosen to serve, please, and remain silent. She observed carefully, said little, and waited. Taizong was powerful, but aging. His court was vast, his favorites many. Wu Zhao made no attempt to climb the ranks. She knew better than to push when no one was watching. When Taizong died in 649, the other concubines were expected to retire to Buddhist convents, to live out their days in prayer and seclusion. Wu Zhao followed them, but she did not stay. Within a few years, she returned to the palace, not by royal decree, but by calculation. The new emperor, Gaozong, Taizong's son, had already noticed her in his father's court. Now, with her head shaved and her robes of mourning exchanged for silk, she re-entered his world not as a shadow, but as a rising moon. Gaozong made her his concubine, then his favored one, then his wife, and eventually his empress. But Empress Wu was not content to share power. She slowly removed her rivals, not always through blood, often through whisper, suggestion, investigation. Rumors became tools. Accusations became weapons. She ruled not from the front of the throne, but from behind it, until even Gaozong, weakened by illness and dependent on her counsel, began to sign imperial edicts in her name. It would not be long before the empire realized that the emperor was no longer the one making decisions, and the woman who had once been silenced by custom would soon speak with a voice that echoed through every chamber of the Tang court. By the time Wu Zhao was officially named empress, the true shape of her power had already taken form, not in open proclamations or thunderous edicts, but in quiet decisions whispered behind curtains, in the subtle shift of authority from the emperor's hand to hers. Gaozong, once vigorous and decisive, had begun to suffer from debilitating illness. His headaches grew more frequent. His vision blurred. His voice, once feared in the court, grew faint. But where his strength faltered, hers rose. Wu did not seize power in a storm. She wove herself into its fabric. She began by overseeing court petitions, helping the emperor interpret legal matters, managing imperial audiences when his health declined. Officials addressed their memorials to her, as often as to him. Ministers, cautious at first, began to recognize that true approval now passed through her hands. The emperor became a figurehead, still robed in authority, but hollowed by reliance. Wu Zhao had become his mind, and she did not stop there. The women of the harem, once her rivals, once comforters to a previous emperor, were now obstacles. One by one, they were disgraced, dismissed, or disappeared. Her own children were elevated in rank. Her trusted allies were placed in positions of influence. She installed spies within the court, in temples, even among the eunuchs, ensuring that no thought could be spoken aloud without her knowing. But power, once gathered, must be held, and in the Tang court, where ancient families traced their lineage to the founding clans of the realm, a woman wielding the scepter of empire was seen not as a ruler, but as a disruption to the natural order. Whispers spread that she was unnatural, that she had bewitched the emperor, that she had manipulated death itself. For few had forgotten how conveniently the previous empress had vanished after Wu's return to court, or how accusations of murder had faded into silence beneath the weight of imperial approval. And Wu Zhao knew those whispers would not stop. So she gave them something else to fear. She surrounded herself with loyal enforcers, men who owed their rise not to family, but to her. She created secret police forces empowered to root out sedition. She began investigations into corruption, into disloyalty, into treason, and under her eye, the line between justice and obedience blurred. Accusation became strategy, confession, currency, fear, a tool sharper than any blade. At court, her presence was omnipresent and yet distant. Draped in ceremonial robes, her gaze cool and unreadable, she watched as ministers debated policies she had already decided. She spoke little. She did not need to. Each silence was filled with meaning, each glance a verdict, and beyond the palace walls, the empire flourished. Despite the fear, despite the executions, Wu Zhao strengthened the central government, reformed the examination system, expanded the reach of the state into the provinces. Roads were repaired, borders were defended, temples were built not merely to honor the gods, but to reinforce her divine mandate. For Wu did not seek merely to govern. She sought to transform her rule into doctrine. The empress had learned the lesson of every great dynasty, that power must not only be claimed, it must be sanctified. And so, from behind silken partitions and shadowed screens, she prepared for what no woman in China's long history had ever dared to claim. Not the place beside the throne, but the throne itself. By the middle years of Emperor Gaozong's reign, it was no longer a secret that the hand guiding the empire belonged not to him, but to the woman seated beside him, and sometimes in his place. Wu Zhao, now empress consort in title but ruler in deed, had so fully occupied the mechanisms of state that even the imperial bureaucracy no longer dared submit proposals without her approval. Ministers bowed to her first. Governors took instruction from her envoys. The people, though distantly aware, began to speak of her as though she were already emperor. Yet still, she did not move too quickly. In China, legitimacy was not merely a matter of power, but of cosmology, a divine alignment of fate, virtue, and mandate known as Tianming, the mandate of heaven. To be emperor was to be chosen not only by men, but by the heavens themselves. And no woman, no matter how wise or commanding, had ever received such a sign. Wu Zhao, if she were to rise, needed more than control. She needed the divine to speak her name. So she built temples. Grand halls of incense and prayer rose across the capital and in the provinces, not in honor of gods alone, but in veneration of the sacred feminine. She promoted Buddhist teachings that spoke of the Bodhisattva Maitreya returning to earth in female form. In private audiences, monks and seers foretold visions of a sage empress who would bring peace to the world. These stories did not spread by accident. They were placed, carefully, persuasively, into the mouths of pilgrims and preachers. And as the religious fervor grew, so too did the perception of Wu Zhao as more than mortal. But even divine favor requires a stage upon which to act, and fate gave her one in the form of decline. Gaozong, long plagued by illness, suffered a final stroke that left him unable to speak. For the last years of his reign, he lived as a silent shadow, wheeled through ceremonial processions, nodded toward during state rituals, but incapable of decision. Wu Zhao assumed full regency, signing decrees in his name, issuing laws with his seal, even receiving foreign emissaries in imperial audiences without pretense. And then, in the year 683, the emperor died. With his death came the moment many believed would end her rise, for tradition dictated that she, as Empress Dowager, would step aside, serve as guardian to her sons, and retire into ritual quiet. But Empress Wu had not spent decades building a throne only to sit beside it. Her eldest son, named emperor in name only, displeased her with his independence. He was dismissed. Another was raised in his place, a child more malleable, more easily directed, until even that mask became unnecessary. In 690, with the machinery of state firmly in her grasp and the stage of heaven prepared, Wu Zhao made the unthinkable declaration. She would not serve as regent. She would rule as sovereign. She dissolved the Tang dynasty, the very house that had once sheltered and elevated her, and proclaimed a new order, the Zhou dynasty, named not for her family, but in symbolic echo of the ancient, revered Zhou of antiquity, thus anchoring her reign not in rebellion, but in restoration. She became Huangdi, emperor, not empress, a title never before held by a woman. And in that moment, the heavens did not crack. The mountains did not fall. The empire, once outraged by the idea, bowed. The phoenix had taken the dragon's place. With the founding of the Zhou dynasty in 690 CE, Wu Zhao crossed the final threshold. She no longer ruled behind the curtain, through a husband, or in the name of a son. She now ruled in her own right. As emperor, sovereign of all under heaven, the single axis upon which the empire turned. And though the proclamation was unprecedented, the empire did not collapse. The sun rose. The officials reported to court. The rituals were conducted with proper solemnity. The world, if it was shocked, kept breathing. But Wu Zhao knew well that legitimacy once claimed must be defended, not just with law, but with results. Her court became a crucible of reform and vigilance. She expanded the civil service examination system, placing greater weight on merit than lineage, offering rare opportunities for scholars from less privileged backgrounds to rise through talent alone. This was not merely benevolence, it was strategy. By weakening the old aristocracy and empowering the bureaucracy she had shaped, Wu ensured her court would be filled with officials loyal to her and her vision, not to ancestral families or outdated norms. She commissioned great public works, reinforcing the Grand Canal and improving road networks, binding together distant provinces with a more efficient arm of administration. Agricultural reforms were introduced to aid farmers, while state granaries helped stabilize grain prices. Her policies, meticulous and often generous, won her a grudging respect even from those who muttered against her rise. The empire, under her steady command, prospered. Yet the silken strength of her rule was also coiled in shadow. Her secret police, known as the Wantai, expanded their influence, rooting out dissent with silent efficiency. Surveillance became the norm in the capital. Those who criticized her too openly vanished, some into exile, others into tombs. Accusations of treason, whether founded or fabricated, carried swift consequences. Court records were watched. Poetry was examined for subtext. Families were warned that loyalty was no longer optional, and memory could be rewritten with a single signature. Wu understood that her gender was both her greatest vulnerability and her most powerful symbol. She made use of it deliberately, cultivating divine associations that no male emperor could claim. In public inscriptions, she portrayed herself as both ruler and mother of the nation, both compassionate and absolute. She commissioned massive Buddhist statues with her features subtly carved into their divine expressions. One monumental likeness of the Maitreya Buddha, carved into the rock face at Longmen, gazed down with her calm, symmetrical face, projecting not power by force, but power by presence. She elevated female relatives to high status, promoted women to court positions typically denied them, and challenged scholars who insisted on female inferiority. But her feminism, if it can be called that, was not ideological. It was personal, political, and practical. She did not seek equality. She sought dominion. Still, in the outer provinces and among Confucian traditionalists, discontent simmered. They called her reign unnatural, her methods corrupt, her rituals heretical. But she remained unmoved. She knew that her authority would never be loved by all, only obeyed. The weight of the crown was hers alone to carry, and she carried it with both elegance and unrelenting purpose. As seasons passed, the empire adapted. Children grew up knowing no male emperor. Portraits of Wu hung where others once saw ancestral patriarchs. The idea of her as ruler became not a question, but a fact, as fixed as the mountains, as regular as the harvest. And for the first time in the long span of Chinese imperial history, the emperor was a woman, not in rumor, not in scandal, but in state decree. As Empress Wu's reign stretched into its second decade, the lines between her public image and private intentions grew ever more intricate. Like the silk tapestries that adorned her palace halls, rich with patterns that revealed themselves only when viewed from the right distance. She had become more than emperor in title. She was now the embodiment of a new order, one where precedent bent to will and history bowed to narrative. But to sustain that order, she had to master appearances. The imperial court was no longer simply a place of governance. It was a theater meticulously staged, in which every gesture, every phrase, every decree was calibrated to reinforce her legitimacy and omnipresence. Ceremonies were lengthened, processions grew more elaborate, and edicts were adorned with language that cast her as both mother and sovereign, both flesh and myth. She was referred to as the sacred and divine emperor, her pronouncements framed with celestial metaphors, her authority likened to the revolving of the stars. Yet in private, she remained ever vigilant. She knew that power was not a possession but a performance, one that must be continually rehearsed, refined, and reinforced. Her network of informants deepened, not only within the palace but throughout the empire. She placed trusted eyes in the homes of ministers, in temples, in academies, listening for heresy not just against her reign, but against the story she had crafted. The penalties for suspicion were rarely delayed. Trials were swift, records often sealed. History, if inconvenient, was rewritten. Still, her rule was not without moments of grace. She rewarded loyalty handsomely. She funded the arts, especially poetry, and fostered an intellectual climate where brilliance, regardless of background, could rise. She surrounded herself with scholars and advisors who challenged her mind, though never her authority. And for all the fear she inspired, many within the inner court found in her a ruler who listened with clarity, who decided with logic, and who valued competence above pedigree. But as age crept into her limbs and the passage of time began to wear at even her iron discipline, she turned increasingly inward, consulting astrologers and diviners, seeking reassurance from the stars that her mandate remained intact. Dreams were recorded and interpreted. Celestial events were logged beside imperial edicts. A comet, a solar halo, a drought, all were read as signals. In the mirror of heaven, she searched for her reflection, unwilling to admit the inevitable approach of mortality. Rival factions, long dormant, began to stir. The imperial family, especially sons and distant cousins of the old Tang bloodline, watched with patience, whispering in corners, calculating her decline. Ministers who had once pledged their lives to her began sending secret messages, testing the loyalty of generals stationed far from the capital. And within the court, the name of the Tang, the dynasty she had dissolved, began to resurface in cautious tones, cloaked in poetry, encoded in memorials, wrapped in nostalgia. Wu knew the pattern well. She had used it herself. She began rotating officials more frequently. She dismissed favorites. She exiled advisors who had grown too familiar. Even those closest to her were not spared. Trust, once the core of her survival, had become a liability. Only distance could now preserve her command. But the distance came at a cost. She ruled still, unchallenged, unmatched, but she ruled in mirrors, through masks, through layers of ritual and solitude that no longer reflected the confidence of youth, but the desperation of permanence. And as the court bowed deeper and spoke softer, she felt, for the first time, the shape of her own shadow. By the early 700s, the grandeur of Wu Zhao's reign remained visible in every aspect of the Tang court's ceremonial life. In the marble pillars carved with dragons and phoenixes, in the embroidered banners that fluttered above processions, in the slow and reverent tones with which ministers addressed their sovereign. But beneath the surface, the foundation had begun to tremble, worn by time, eroded by paranoia, and weakened by the isolation of its architect. Wu Zhao, now well into her 70s, rarely appeared in open court. Her audiences were limited to carefully chosen officials, her communications filtered through eunuchs and scribes. Her health, once a symbol of divine favor, had begun to fail in ways impossible to conceal. She suffered from bouts of dizziness, periods of fatigue, and long silences between decrees. Her once commanding presence had diminished, not entirely in body, but in reach. In this silence, the ambitions of others began to stir. Her sons, long kept from true power, had grown restless. They had seen the empire governed with precision and cruelty, with brilliance and fear, and now, as their mother's light dimmed, they watched one another with suspicion, each hoping to be the one to rise when her reign ended. Crown princes had come and gone, some disgraced, others eliminated. No successor had been clearly marked. This uncertainty, once a tool of control, now invited instability. Meanwhile, factions within the palace coalesced around competing interests. The Zhang brothers, two favored courtiers known for their beauty and flattery, had secured unusual influence, managing affairs through their intimacy with the aging empress. Their arrogance grew unchecked. Their enemies multiplied. Many in the bureaucracy saw them not as servants of the state, but as parasites, feeding on a dynasty too weary to defend itself. Outside the palace, the people still revered Wu's name, but rumors spread of her failing memory, of plots hidden in her chambers, of omens in the sky that foretold the end of her mandate. Earthquakes, eclipses, famines, all were read as signals that heaven had turned its face. Even monks and astrologers who once praised her began to hedge their visions, offering interpretations that suggested not fall, but transformation, a gentle way to prepare for change. Wu Zhao, though frail, was not blind to the shifting air. She dismissed the Zhang brothers abruptly, their fall as sudden as their rise, their execution swift and unceremonious. She tried to reassert control, to clarify succession, to install her son Li Xian, once disgraced, now restored, as heir. But the momentum of history had already begun its descent, and each act of discipline now felt reactive, not sovereign. The empress who had once shaped the court like clay now seemed to respond to forces no longer of her making. In the winter of 705, with her health in sharp decline and her isolation complete, a coalition of ministers and generals, long simmering with resentment, seized the moment. They stormed the palace in a swift and bloodless coup. The eunuchs were disarmed. Loyal guards stood down. Wu Zhao, too weak to resist and perhaps too tired to try, was forced to abdicate. She did so without protest. After nearly half a century at the heart of power, the empress stepped away from the throne, not in disgrace, but in retreat, her departure staged with the same ritual dignity she had used to construct her rise. The Tang dynasty was restored. The phoenix, having burned through the sky of empire, now returned to ash, but the fire she kindled would never fully die. After her abdication, Wu Zhao was moved from the throne room to a quieter palace within the vast imperial complex. Not a prison, not an exile, but a gilded cage lined with memory. The dragon throne, once hers alone, was returned to the Tang lineage, now occupied by her son Li Xian, restored as Emperor Zhongzong, a name spoken with reverence, though his power, even reclaimed, bore the long shadow of his mother's reign. She lived on, still titled Empress Dowager Zetian, not cast out nor executed, a courtesy few expected, a concession to legacy and caution alike. The ministers who had orchestrated her removal knew the risk of martyrdom, knew that to stain her name too hastily might stir unrest, and so they allowed her to fade, with dignity, into seclusion. Her final months passed in the still rhythm of ritual and routine, surrounded by attendants who had once bowed to her as emperor, now serving her as elder. Her body, long defiant, now trembled with age. Her mind, once quick and ruthless, wandered through fragments of poetry and prayer. Some days, she issued commentary on matters of state. Other days, she sat in silence, staring past the latticework windows, eyes fixed on a sky that had once seemed hers to command. She was not forgotten. She was studied, gossiped about, quietly feared. Within the court, ministers debated how to handle her legacy. Some advocated for silence, others for condemnation. But no one could deny what she had done. She had ruled. She had reigned. She had become emperor, and not in name alone. She died in late 705, shortly after her abdication, her body failing quietly, her breath slipping out like a candle in still air. The court mourned, carefully, ceremonially, not as they would a revered patriarch, but as one might grieve a vanished star, distant, luminous, no longer dangerous, and impossible to ignore. There was hesitation about how to mark her passing. To bury her with full imperial honors would enshrine her rule as legitimate. To deny her such rights would risk unrest. A compromise was reached. She was interred alongside her husband, Emperor Gaozong, in the Grand Qianling Mausoleum. Her tomb's stele, unlike all others of imperial rank, was left intentionally blank. No words, no praise, no condemnation, only stone. That silence, more than any eulogy, has echoed through centuries. Later generations would argue about her. Confucian historians called her wicked, unnatural, a usurper cloaked in silk and blood. Others saw her as a reformer, a visionary who reshaped the imperial system, who gave voice, however briefly, to women and scholars outside the traditional elite. Modern thinkers have sought to reclaim her, not as villain or saint, but as what she was, a woman who ruled with the tools available, who survived a system designed to erase her, and who, in doing so, carved her name into the marble spine of history. Her rule did not endure. The Zhou dynasty ended with her, but the Tang continued, informed by what she had shown was possible. And though the sky returned to its familiar stars, one constellation remained altered, the image of a phoenix, fleeting but unforgettable, traced in the wake of a woman who, for a moment, had redefined the cosmos. With Wu Zhao gone, and the Tang dynasty restored to its ancestral name, the court turned its gaze backward, struggling to reconcile the long reign of a woman who had broken every precedent, yet left the empire intact, restructured, rebalanced, and marked by both cruelty and vision. Emperor Zhongzong, her son, now sat on the throne not as a conqueror of his mother's legacy, but as its reluctant heir, shadowed by a memory too vast to erase and too complex to sanctify. He restored the old rituals. He reinstated ancestral names. He surrounded himself with ministers who had once opposed her. But even as he tried to unmake her reign and symbol, he could not reverse the changes it had wrought. The bureaucracy she had reformed remained efficient. The meritocratic examination system continued to flourish. The network of roads, the expanded granaries, the improved provincial oversight, all bore her signature. In truth, her ghost walked the halls more thoroughly than many of the living. Officials who had risen under her rule remained in place, cautious but present. The courts still used legal precedents she had refined. Even the secret police, though disbanded in form, lingered in habit, a watchful air that never quite faded from the capital. It was easier to erase her name from records than to undo her influence from the machinery of governance. And the people remembered. Among the commoners, especially in the regions where her reforms had lowered tax burdens or improved infrastructure, tales of her reign were retold in tones of awe rather than fear. She was the old Buddha, the Iron Empress whose gaze had pierced lies and whose justice, though severe, had balanced the scales for those unheard by the elite. Mothers spoke of her with caution but pride. Scholars debated her methods, but none denied her intellect. Poets, many of whom owed their place in court to her patronage, wrote in coded verses, honoring her ambition under the veil of metaphor. Yet not all memory was kind. Among conservative scholars and highborn clans, she remained a warning, a distortion of natural order, a disruption of cosmic harmony. They blamed her for the erosion of courtly virtue, for the elevation of men of low birth, for the deaths of countless rivals silenced without trial. They feared what she symbolized more than what she had done. For if one woman could seize the mandate of heaven, what other unthinkable truths might one day be realized? And so, her legacy became a mirror. To those who feared change, she was tyranny incarnate. To those who hungered for merit over bloodline, she was a brief, shining proof that ability could trump birth. To women, across centuries, she became both inspiration and impossibility. She had broken the ceiling of imperial power, not by easing through it, but by tearing it down and rebuilding it in her image. And yet her path was so narrow, so fraught, so drenched in danger, that few could follow without peril. As decades passed, later Tang emperors would occasionally speak her name, not as a predecessor, but as a parable. They would point to her to justify firmness, or to caution against ambition. Her face, never officially displayed, appeared in whispered stories, in uncommissioned scrolls, in temples where monks spoke her titles under their breath. She became folklore and forbidden memory, her silence more potent than any proclamation. And through it all, her tomb remained untouched, the blank stele at Qianling silently recording everything that could not be said. Centuries turned. Dynasties fell and rose again. The Mongol Yuan, the native Ming, the conquering Qing. Each claimed the mandate of heaven. Each built palaces on the bones of predecessors. Each added their own calligraphy to the grand story of China. And through every age, Empress Wu remained a question that refused to fade. A riddle carved not in jade or bronze, but in silence and contradiction. Historians, scribes, and philosophers debated her with obsessive intensity, but never with consensus. Some chroniclers denounced her as a tyrant, placing her name alongside the worst examples of despotism, pointing to her ruthless consolidations of power, her purges, her use of spies, her readiness to sacrifice even her own children to the machinery of the throne. They called her reign a deviation from moral order, a blemish on the Confucian ideal of hierarchy, not because she failed, but because she succeeded where she should not have dared to rise. Others, more cautiously, spoke of her reforms, her patronage of learning, her protection of Buddhism in the face of Confucian orthodoxy. They studied her promotion of scholars from humble origins, her merit-based bureaucracy, her efforts to balance regional power and strengthen the state. They noted the paradox, that beneath the iron of her rule, many found opportunity, stability, and clarity. As Chinese society evolved, so too did its image of her. In the 20th century, as China grappled with revolution, warlordism, and foreign invasion, Wu Zhao was rediscovered not only as a ruler, but as a woman who had defied her age. Feminist writers explored her life as both an indictment and inspiration, the lengths she went to, the cost she bore, and the power she refused to relinquish. They asked if her methods would have been judged differently had she been born a man. They noted that her greatest crime, in the eyes of many, was not cruelty or cunning, but competence. Popular culture took hold. Plays and novels reimagined her rise. Paintings recreated her court. Television dramas cast her as everything from villain to saint, from manipulator to misunderstood genius. Her name, once spoken in whispers, now echoed in classrooms and theaters, debated with intensity, dramatized with flair. Yet no new dynasty ever produced a ruler like her. No woman after Wu would ever again sit upon the dragon throne. The institutions she shaped endured, the systems she refined survived, but the path she carved through history remained solitary, sharp, dangerous, and unreplicated. Her rule had not opened a door. It had merely shown that one existed, if only for a moment, and then sealed shut behind her. Her tomb, at Qianling, still rests beneath the twin peaks of Liangshan, guarded by stone lions and mythic beasts. Pilgrims and scholars still visit, some in awe, others in curiosity. The stele, blank as ever, rises tall above the earth, a monument to all that was spoken through action and denied by inscription. It says nothing, and in doing so, it says everything. Wu Zhao's reign ended in ritual. Her name was scratched from records, restored, and debated again. But the question she left behind still hums quietly in the scrollwork of history. What becomes of the world when a woman does not wait to be chosen, but chooses herself? And when that choice is written in law, sealed with blood, and crowned in gold, who dares to follow? In the long corridors of history, where the voices of rulers fade into stone and the names of empires dissolve beneath the tide of time, Empress Wu remains, not as an echo, but as a whisper that never stops circling. Her reign is over. Her tomb is sealed. Her title, once erased and restored, now rests uncertain on the tongues of scholars. Yet the shape of her story persists, too complex to be silenced, too vital to be forgotten. She came to power in a world that did not have a place for her. She made one. She ruled not as a queen beside a king, but as the sovereign, the absolute, the architect of empire and executor of its will. In an age that revered order and hierarchy, she inverted both. In a society built on lineage and male authority, she rose from concubine to emperor. In a tradition that deified continuity, she severed the dynasty and replaced it with one of her own design. But she did not do this gently. Her methods were hard, her decisions cold. Her legacy, forever braided with brilliance and brutality, has never been clean. And perhaps that is the point. For Wu Zhao, the only female emperor in over 2 millennia of imperial China, was not merely exceptional because she was a woman who ruled. She was exceptional because she ruled completely, because she built not just a throne, but a system, not just an image, but a mythology, and because she held it, through age, through rebellion, through centuries that insisted she should have disappeared long before her final breath. She is now taught in textbooks, featured in museums, interpreted through the lens of every generation that rediscovers her. To some, she is a cautionary tale. To others, a figure of defiant inspiration. And to many, she is both. A reminder that greatness and cost are often inseparable, that ambition may lift nations and break them in the same breath, and that power, once taken, leaves a trail that no silence can erase. No other woman would ever wear the imperial crown, but her absence from the throne after her death only sharpened the outline of her presence while alive. She changed the language of what was possible, not by asking for permission, but by issuing commands. Not by becoming what the world expected, but by reshaping the world to expect her. Her tomb remains uninscribed, but the world is not. Her name has crossed dynasties, revolutions, and ages, her story adapted, disputed, revived, not for what she believed in, but for what she proved. That even within the most rigid walls, a voice can rise. Even in the deepest shadows, a woman can cast light. And though the Tang was restored, and the Zhou vanished with her, something else endured. A presence in the silk of court robes, in the patterns of power, in the knowledge that once, the heavens were not only ruled by men. This was the whisper that endured. This was Wu Zhao. And history still listens.